Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate all of you being here. Always love to hear the chatter pre-meeting. That's kind of a happy sound. That means people are communicating and getting acquainted. That's always a very good thing. So thank you very much. We appreciate you being here today. Thank you all for leaving your busy lives and coming down to share some time with us so that we can hopefully share some information with you that will be helpful. We appreciate your support of the Coalition in Housing in Nevada. I want to begin today by thanking the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, Chris Ferreira. Chris, who are you and why are you here?
Hi, I'm Chris Ferreira from the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. For those that aren't aware, we're a government-sponsored enterprise similar to Fannie or Freddie. We are a private corporation, but we have our roots in the government. And so we have a public service mission. Part of, on the business side of what the Federal Home Loan Bank does is to provide liquidity to the mortgage market. But on the public service side, we provide a lot of grants and support for affordable housing and economic development. So our interest today is in Nevada and, of course, supporting the coalition. We work through Arizona, California, and Nevada. And so we are proud to support the coalition. We have given them a grant through our AHEAD Economic Development Grant Program, and then we're of course supporting this event. So anyway, just want to thank you, congratulations for launching Coalition this year, and looking forward to the event.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you for breakfast. The Federal Home Loan Bank sponsoring us this morning, we really appreciate that very much. Forgot to introduce myself, which is very common. I'm Bill Brewer. I'm the Executive Director for the Nevada Rural Housing Authority. Also happen to be the President of the Nevada Housing Coalition. So that's why I'm here in front of the room this morning. As an organization, we're growing up. We have only been in existence for just about a year now. We're increasing our membership and had a successful legislative session. Not that we were tooled up for a whole lot of housing issues because we're so new, but there are several issues in the legislature that we were able to support, and we're excited to see those get through. We appreciate Senator Reddy for being the tip of the spear on that in the legislature. That was really awesome. As an organization, we've really done a lot of work to focus on tracking and supporting policies that will help us develop more affordable housing in Nevada. Our mission is to create sustainable solutions through community awareness, capacity building, and advocacy to assure housing options for all Nevadans. That's our mission. That's what we focused on with our efforts. Our policy committee, I should say, also keeps an eye on federal policy. There are a number of those in the works. You're going to hear more about that today. Some of these are pretty exciting. I'm anxious to hear how excited we should be if they're going to get close to passing or not. We'll also be rolling out a monthly newsletter. We're in the process of getting that stood up right now, so our members will be able to receive information on a monthly basis, keep you current on what's happening in the legislature, what's happening locally, what events there might be, educational opportunities, all those things, to keep you informed as part of your membership in the coalition. We're also hosting another event similar to this in Las Vegas. If you happen to be in Las Vegas on the 20th of November. It will be focused on displacement, though, different content than this meeting is. We'll talk about displacement and what that means in terms of housing affordability and to the people who are being displaced. As this organization grows up, we also need to grow up. We're looking for an executive director right now. It's a part-time position. But if any of you are interested, go to our website, find the link, put in an application. We'd love to talk to you. We also are looking at a larger format meeting for the coalition this coming spring, and we'll be putting that together. If you have any thoughts about that or ideas, let us know. We'd love to talk to you about that. Today's program will be focusing on housing, what housing policy looks like coming down the road, what it looks like in practice when we put it into place and make it work for us here in Nevada. So first we'll hear from Brooke Shipwright. Brooke represents the National Low-Income Housing
Yep,
I'll get
coalition.
all of
Yep,
that
I got
right.
it.
I had that perfect when I came in here this morning. National Low Income Housing Coalition. She is well attuned to all the national legislation that's pending right now and can really get us hopefully fired up to support some of that. Our legislative folks are standing behind some of this, and that's good to see. We're really happy about that. Then we'll hear from Steve Acroft, who heads up the Nevada Housing Division. He's the guy that's responsible to make all this stuff work, put it into action once it comes down the road. So some great opportunities to learn what's going on in Nevada. I guarantee you'll hear something today you didn't know about when you came in. So that's pretty exciting. So we'll start with Brooke, and we'll go from there.
All right, thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone.
Man, I missed all the slides. There you are.
Do you want me to run the clicker?
There you are. I wanted to get you up to speed.
Okay, great. And I just hit the right arrow, I assume? Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. So as Bill said, my name is Brooke Shipwright. I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. Nevada is one of the 13 states that I cover. We're based out of Washington, D.C., and so thanks to the Nevada Housing Coalition for inviting me to be, or the National Low Income Housing Coalition, to be part of today's event. So this morning I'm going to briefly go over who NLIHC is and what some of our data says about the current state of housing affordability. And then we're going to dive into what's being proposed to address this and how you can get involved and why your voice matters in this work. So at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we work alongside our members and partners to advance socially just public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes across the U.S. Have affordable homes. And we do this through research, advocacy, and education. While there are many organizations out there that focus on federal housing policy, NLIHC is unique because of our sole focus on people with extremely low incomes and very low incomes. And we focus on these two income groups because the private housing market cannot adequately provide safe, decent, affordable homes for these income groups without some form of subsidy. So our members and partners include a broad group of coalitions, service providers, developers, resident associations, and other groups and individuals who are interested in affordable housing issues. So let's get into what the data tells us about the nation's housing affordability crisis. One of our two annual research reports, which some of you may be familiar with, is Out of Reach. We celebrated our 30th anniversary of Out of Reach this year, which was really exciting. It was released in June. And this report documents the housing wage, which means how much someone would have to make an hour to afford a modest rental home. And we calculate this for every county, metropolitan area, state, and the nation as a whole. So I know your group has discussed Out of Reach data at previous events, but what I'm sharing today, I'm told, is updated and new from what you guys have all discussed in the past, so these are new numbers. So this year, our housing wage calculated for the nation on average is nearly $23 an hour, which means a household must earn $23 an hour for a modest 2-bedroom apartment, which is up almost $1 from last year's number. That means a worker earning the federal minimum wage must work nearly 127 hours a week, or more than 3 full-time jobs, to afford a modest 2-bedroom home and 103 hours a week for a modest 1-bedroom. These numbers do vary with differences in housing markets and wages across the country, of course. But like I said earlier, I didn't say this earlier, but there is actually not a single county in our country where a full-time worker earning the prevailing minimum wage, which is, the state or the federal, whichever is higher, can afford a modest 2-bedroom home, and only 28 counties can they afford a modest 1-bedroom. So this year's, let's see, sorry, just one second here. So we calculate also for each state and metropolitan area, like I said. So Nevada is a little lower at just under $19 an hour, which means that someone would have to work 91 hours a week at minimum wage to afford a 2-bedroom and 73 hours a week to afford a 1-bedroom. Yeah, so here in Reno, it's a little higher at almost $20 an hour. We also calculate how the national housing wages compare with median wages for occupations with the most projected growth over the next decade. So you'll see on this chart, the red is the 2-bedroom housing wage and then the 1-bedroom housing wage. The 3 above that are the only 3 occupations that make enough to meet that target. And these are software developers, general and operations managers, and registered nurses. Others, such as home health aides, food service workers, and medical assistants, all make less on average. And finally, this year, which was new to this report, we compared 1- and 2-bedroom housing wages with hourly wage percentiles and broke these percentiles down by race and gender. This particular chart shows by race. So the dark blue represents white, blue represents black, gray represents Hispanic, and then each section is, if you can't see in the back, we go from the 10th percentile wage across to the 60th percentile wage. And then the dashed blue line on top is the 2-bedroom housing wage, and then the red is the 1-bedroom housing wage. So you'll see that only to the 50th percentile wage is where anyone actually crosses that, and it's only the white group category here. And then you'll also see that black and Hispanic wage earners go through the 60th percentile wage and never meet that threshold. So to sum it up, wages have not kept pace with the rising costs of housing, and as many of you know, there is an inadequate supply of affordable homes across our nation, and there's not enough funding flowing to housing assistance programs. So states and localities play an important role, but they alone cannot solve it. As a nation, we have the resources, but we just need the political will from Congress to put those forward. So let's turn to what solutions are being proposed at the federal level. NLHC is a nonpartisan organization, which means that we support any good housing policy that helps us achieve our mission, regardless of which aisle it comes from, which side of the aisle it comes from. And it's true that many of the housing-related bills we're currently supporting have been introduced by more Democrats than Republicans, but not exclusively, and we work hard to gain co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle because good housing policy affects people across the political spectrum. So for example, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which I know the Nevada Housing Coalition has been actively advocating for, it's a bill with a slate of bipartisan support. I believe in the House it's over 100 bipartisan co-sponsors, and more are continuing to sign on, which is awesome. I think the number in the Senate is pretty high too, but I can't remember exactly what it is. This bill would take important steps towards alleviating the nation's housing affordability crisis by incentivizing developers to better serve the lowest income families through the low-income housing tax credit program, which, as many of you know, is the primary source of financing for the construction and preservation of affordable housing. Specifically, it includes a 50% expansion of the housing credit, a 50% basis boost for development that set aside at least 20% of units for households with extremely low incomes or for people who are experiencing homelessness, and developments in native and rural communities. And developments in native and rural communities would be automatically eligible for a 30% basis boost to increase the investment of housing credits in these areas. So in Nevada, as of Monday when I checked, we have Representatives Titus, Lee, is it Amodei or Amodi? Amodei, okay, I was way off, and Horsford. And then we have Senator Cortez Masto on the Senate side, which I heard was just a couple of weeks ago, which is very exciting. So thank you all for your advocacy efforts on that. So another bipartisan example of federal legislation that we support is the Task Force on the Impact of the Affordable Housing Crisis Act. which would establish a bipartisan task force to evaluate and create recommendations for the affordable housing crisis. It was introduced by Republican Senator Todd Young of Indiana, and a companion bill was introduced in the House by Democratic Representative Peters of California. There are currently no co-sponsors from Nevada on this bill in the House or Senate. And again, all of these I checked on Monday, so it could have changed since then, but this is the most up-to-date information I have. One bill I failed to include under these bipartisan policy proposals, but that you might be interested in hearing about, is the HUD Manufactured Housing Modernization Act of 2019, which is a bipartisan bill introduced by your very own Senator Cortez Masto, along with 3 other bipartisan senators. And the bill would support state and local governments that wish to include manufactured homes as an affordable housing solution when applying for federal funding. And the Senate Banking Committee is actually holding a hearing about that today. So some other bold pieces of legislation that we're actively supporting fall under the categories of new investments, bridging the gap between incomes and rent, advancing fair housing and equity, and ensuring equitable disaster recovery. So I'm not going to get into all of the pieces of legislation that we follow under these categories, but there are a few I want to highlight. The first is the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. It was introduced by Senator Warren in the Senate and Representative Richmond of Louisiana in the House. This ambitious proposal would help end housing poverty and homelessness in America because it gets at the root issue, which is the shortage of affordable homes. It would do this through a robust investment of nearly $45 billion annually to the National Housing Trust Fund, which, if you're not familiar with what that is, it is a critical resource for protecting and expanding affordable homes for people with extremely low incomes. But it's currently very underfunded. So we're advocating for bills like this that would help reach the funding needed. This bill also includes resources to repair public housing and build, rehabilitate, and preserve affordable homes in rural and tribal areas. It provides incentives to encourage local governments to address regulatory barriers, which would get at the affordability crisis for the middle income or middle class in some cities, and includes measures to reverse racial inequity. There are currently no co-sponsors from Nevada on this bill in either chamber. And then the next is the Ending Homelessness Act, which was introduced by Representative Maxine Waters of California. And it was actually introduced recently on the Senate side by Senator Harris. It would invest more than $13 billion over 5 years to address the shortage of affordable homes and combat homelessness, including $1 billion annually for the National Housing Trust Fund. It passed out of committee on the House side, I believe, in late spring or early summer. It's not clear when it will reach the floor for a vote, and there are currently no co-sponsors on either side from Nevada. Now turning to how we bridge the gap between incomes and rent. So the Rent Relief Act was introduced by Senator Harris of California and Representative Danny Davis of Illinois. It would create a new refundable tax credit to cost-burden households to help millions of the lowest income people afford roofs over their heads. And this, too, currently has no co-sponsors from Nevada on either side. And then finally, I want to talk about a couple of proposals related to fair housing and equity. So the first of these is the Fair Housing Improvement Act, which expands the Fair Housing Act to protect veterans and low-income families from housing discrimination. Currently, many who use vouchers can be turned away and face limited options because landlords can choose not to accept this form of payment. So if passed, this bill would prohibit housing discrimination based on veteran status, as well as source of income, which includes Social Security or a housing choice voucher. The bill was introduced by Senator Kane of Virginia and Representative Peters of California. Senator Jackie Rosen of Nevada is currently the only co-sponsor on the Senate side altogether, and there are no Nevadan representatives signed on to the bill on the House side. And the other fair housing and equity bill I want to talk about is the Fair Chance at Housing Act, which was introduced by Senator Harris and Representative Ocasio-Cortez. So as many of you know, every year we have hundreds of thousands of people returning to their communities from prison and often face very limited housing options and leaves them housing insecure. So this proposal would reform ways in which public housing agencies and owners of federally assisted housing can screen out applicants and evict tenants based on their involvement with the criminal justice system so as to expand housing options. There are currently no co-sponsors from Nevada on this bill in either chamber as well. So these are all exciting proposals that would get us closer to ending housing poverty and homelessness, but we need to build on this momentum and see that they advance. So national advocacy groups like NLIHC can be effective in moving legislation forward, but the voices that matter most to the members of Congress are their constituents and even more so their voting constituents. But we often hear, well, my elected official is a lost cause, or my elected officials already support this issue, so what's the point? Well, when thinking about advocacy, it's important to keep in mind that the goal of this work is to not just determine where someone stands on an issue, but to move them along the spectrum. So let's say they're a staunch opponent about affordable housing issues. Your goal is to just get them to be a little bit quieter about their opposition. Or let's say they're a supporter. Wait, you don't have to swing them to the other side. Just try to get them to be less of a barrier in our work. Let's say they're a supporter, which is great, but your goal then is to get them to be a champion of affordable housing issues. And this means stepping out of their comfort zone, being a little louder about affordable housing solutions, and proposing solutions forward and speaking out for us. So advocacy activities can be as simple as taking 5 minutes to call your members of Congress or email them. And all you have to do in the simplest form is just tell them that you're a constituent and that you care about protecting and expanding affordable housing issues or housing resources for people with the lowest incomes. You might be surprised to learn that many members will flag an issue after hearing from just a handful of constituents about it. Your advocacy can also be more involved, such as meeting with elected officials or their staff to share your views and experiences, getting involved in our annual National Housing Week of Action in the spring by hosting local events, or educating voters and candidates on affordable housing issues and solutions through our current project called Our Homes, Our Votes 2020. This project is working to elevate the conversation of affordable housing issues and solutions in the 2020 presidential elections and provides tools and resources for people like you who might want to engage voters and candidates to do the same at all levels of government. So we have a comprehensive toolkit for nonprofits to engage in a nonpartisan way without risking their 501c3 status. And we're hosting monthly webinar and podcast series to dive deeper into these election engagement strategies. We're calling it Third Thursdays at 3, but that's only applicable to the East Coast, so it's really every third Thursday of the month at noon, your time. So 2 weeks from today at noon is our next one. And finally, we're also tracking what the presidential candidates are saying about affordable housing and what plans they're proposing. So you can find all of these resources, each candidate's plan that who has one, and other information at ourhomes-ourvotes.org, or you can connect with me directly. So in addition to this project and other activities throughout the year, what else can you do as advocates to help make change happen? So the most pressing issue for Congress right now is the federal budget and finalizing appropriations bills. So what we need from you right now is to call your legislators and ask them to fund affordable housing and community development programs to the highest level possible. And possibly at this point, more importantly, is to ask them to work with their colleagues to ensure that they do not have another government shutdown. So as you heard, many of the bills that we're tracking do not have Nevadan co-sponsors, yet our data shows that, our gap report data shows that Nevada has the greatest shortage of affordable and available homes for extremely low-income households in the country. So this means your members need to hear from you, their constituents, to show them this is an important issue for the people that they they supposedly work for. So while you have them on the phone, you can also ask them to support and co-sponsor the bold proposals I shared with you today. Or if they're already a co-sponsor, like I listed before, be sure to thank them. This is something that we often overlook as advocates. Thanking your members is often, it's an important relationship building tactic. And it reminds their offices, like I said before earlier, if they're a supporter, it reminds them that this is an issue that affects their constituents and that their constituents care about. So if you're interested in finding co-sponsors of each bill, you can go to congress.gov or, again, contact me directly. I'm happy to look that up for you. So finally, I just want to quickly flip through some NLIHC resources that we provide to make advocacy for affordable housing easier. So first is our Advocates Guide. It's basically our housing Bible of all things federal housing and community development programs. We kind of have like a summary of each program, the history and background, how they work, and what advocates should know and do for each one. So there's tips for advocacy, there's tips for organizing, in addition to all of these. Oh, and we update it annually. It's available, a digital copy is available for free online at nlihc.org, or you can also order one that we'll mail to you. And we have a lot of them, so. Our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign is our multi-sector campaign. It's a great resource for demonstrating how central an affordable home is to all other areas of life. They have some really great fact sheets and infographics that demonstrate how housing is connected to different sectors like education, economic growth, that type of stuff. I think this is really useful in advocating to elected officials, as well as just others, educating others about the importance of affordable homes and why they should care about this work. The GAP I mentioned documents the shortage of affordable homes. That's an annual research report. Out of Reach is the one that we just talked about. Both have interactive mapping tools and fact sheets online, state-specific fact sheets as well. So I encourage you to check those out. Tenant Talk is we produce twice a year. It's created by and for, directed towards people, renters, low-income renters. So we just put out our most recent issue last month, and it was focusing on public housing. Our housing advocacy organizers make up our field, what we call our field team, and there's 4 of us. And I cover all of the red states here, so Nevada is one of my states. So what that means is I'm a bridge. I can serve as a bridge for you, a resource for you between what's happening on Capitol Hill and what's happening here in Nevada. So if there's anything we can be doing to support your efforts here in Nevada, we're happy to do that when capacity allows. So please be in touch with us. But also if you need any information from us about what's happening on the federal level, we're happy to do that as well. Finally, I just want to quickly point out that NLIHC, like Nevada Housing Coalition, is a membership organization. And at NLIHC, we have both individual and organizational memberships available. And they're available at any cost or any amount that works for you. So they're all suggested dues. And it really just helps support our work. So please consider becoming one and stay in touch. I'd love to connect with you all and learn more about what you're doing here in Nevada. So, thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. That was fantastic. We'll have an opportunity for Q&A when Steve is finished. So as we go through these, hopefully you're writing your questions down. You'll have a good opportunity to ask these guys anything you want to know a little bit later. I will just mention, as Brooke was speaking about the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, all of Nevada's legislators are signed on to that as co-sponsors, except for Jackie Rosen. And I've learned that she's ready to sign on. She'll be anxious to sign on, but they're only letting Democrats sign on as Republicans come onto the bill. So we need some more Republicans to sign up, then we can get Senator Rosen on there. On the House side, Representative Amadei agreed to sign on. We were very pleased to see that. So if you have a chance to thank him for that when he's around town, please do that. a great thing for affordable housing. That act is very broad and covers a waterfront of housing issues. Be tremendous if we could get that passed. I want to remind you that there are some materials out on the table in the hallway that the Housing Division brought to us today, and Brooke also has some stuff out there, so feel free to help yourself to that. With that, we'll turn the time over to Steve Acroft, and he'll tell us what's happening in Nevada.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you all for coming out on this glorious Nevada morning in November.
Yes.
Almost should be doing this outside.
Yeah, almost.
And thank you, Bill, and the coalition members for having me here. So, and Bill gives me a little too much credit when he says Steve is heading up the charge to make it happen. Nothing we do at the Nevada Housing Division, we do in a vacuum. It requires an awful lot of collaboration with a lot of folks in this room. And so what I'm going to do here first to start out with, and some of you have seen this before, and I apologize for that, but I know at least one individual has not seen this and asked me what we do. So I'm going to spend about 5 or 10 minutes kind of going over what the Nevada Housing Division does. So we are a state agency. We're unique. Most state housing finance agencies, and that's effectively what we are. We are not all things housing, but we do a lot. And we are purely a governmental agency. We are underneath the Department of Business and Industry for the state of Nevada. And our mission is to improve lives, strengthen Nevada communities, by expanding housing opportunities, building self-sufficiency, protecting the residents and industry of manufactured housing, and fostering economic development. So that's pretty much our charge. And what we do, we accomplish that through about a half a dozen things here. Home ownership opportunities, and I'll touch on all these in a moment. Production and preservation of multifamily rentals, state and federal grants assistance. We have oversight of manufactured housing throughout the state. We work on weatherization programs, and we examine low-income housing data and advocacy. But we're not an advocacy organization. I do want to be clear about that. We are a governmental entity. We work in the executive branch. And so when you sort of come to us and want us to push something, that's really where you need to go to the coalition. So, and they can stay forward, and we'll try to make it happen. Our programs for home buyers. We have 3 effective programs, all kind of under the Home as Possible umbrella. It provides down payment assistance for up to 5% of the purchase price of the home for incomes below $98,500 and home prices below $400,000. We have a separate program for teachers, for veterans. We'll go there next, which is a below market interest rate. Our VA loans are 100% loans. They don't need any down payment assistance. So we're able to purchase the interest rate, buy the interest rate down a little bit. So if you're an active veteran, family, surviving spouse, you'll actually get a below market interest rate on your VA loan. And we've done, in that program, over 1,400 veteran families have taken advantage of that program. We also have a secondary program for teachers, which does a below market interest rate, but also provides a down payment assistance. So using that, we've created, and that's been going for about 3-4 years now, and that's, we've recruited over 750 teachers. That's how we like to view it. Coming into the state and purchasing homes and providing home ownership opportunities for teachers. Our multifamily programs basically fall into 2 buckets. And Brooke touched upon the low-income housing tax credit program. That's basically where these 2 programs exist. So the first one is the low-income housing tax credit program, and we are the allocation agency for these federal taxes or tax credits. And the LIHTC program, LIHTC, over there on the left, that is a program that it's called the 9% program, and will provide about 70% equity to a project. And what that means is we're able to, if you have $1, 70% of it will come out of the tax credits. And by doing that, and using some other layers of financing, mentioned the affordable housing program that the Federal Home Loan Bank does, and some other funding mechanisms, we're able to drive and serve people at 50 and 30% AMI. That's a limited amount of funds. We've done about 600, actually it's more than that now. Last figure I saw was closer to 900, either in the pipeline or completed in the last 4 years of affordable housing. So that's our tool that gets us down into those lower income targeted range that Brooke had mentioned in her report. The tax exempt bond program is sort of our production model, and that's called the 4% program. So if you hear that bandied about, since its inception, we've done over 26,000 multifamily housing units, but that creates about 30% equity. So that gets us to about, we have to now make up that extra 70% through various funding mechanisms. That creates effectively products that are going to serve 60% AMI and below. That's sort of that wheelhouse for that particular program. I mentioned that that only creates about 30% equity, so we have this gap that we noticed a few years back, and so we created our Grow Affordable Housing program. By the time you add up all the funding mechanisms in that 4% program, you get about 91% of the final cost of the project. And so we created this program, which is a $3 million loan that we provide to developers that gets returned to the division, provides that last little bit to get the program over the hill. And I know she's heard this and she's waiting for me to say it. So Senator Ratty, I'll go to the mechanism that I always use, and I don't have the chart for it. But if you go to the dollar store and you have 91 cents in your pocket, what are you coming out with? Nothing. Okay? But if you can search around your car seats and find a dime, just one dime, a skinny dime, you can buy something. That's what this is. This is our dime program. So it's enabled us to do a number of projects throughout the state. And actually, I think the first one, and I'll get to it in a moment, that was completed was Vintage of Crossings. That was the first one in Northern Nevada that had some gap funding. And it also helped create the Steamboat by Vintage project, another 360 units. So we also do other HUD and state programs that we administer. And again, we get these levels of funding and we allocate them to local jurisdictions, nonprofits, things of that nature to try to get these programs, get the dollars out to help create affordable housing. So we have the HOME program, which is designed to develop, build, finance, support low-income housing initiatives. That's the Home Investment Partnership provided by HUD. We have to have a matching fund for that. So we have the State Affordable Housing Trust Fund. In past incarnations, it was called the Low Income Housing Trust Fund. So if you've heard of LIFT funds throughout the state, it's now called Affordable Housing Trust Funds. And that's the match for the HOME program. The HOME program, we get about $3 million annually from the federal government to allocate throughout the state. The State Affordable Housing Trust Fund is created through a real estate transfer tax. That varies year to year. We get about $7 million there to allocate. The National Housing Trust Fund, Brooke sort of touched on, and that's $2 or $3 million a year. I'm not sure which, but it's something along those lines. And then we have an emergency solutions grant, which focuses on rapid rehousing initiatives and basically is for homeless prevention. We also have two programs that we do that are funded by the state. One is the lot rent subsidy, which reduces the monthly rent associated with a manufactured home lot space in a manufactured home community. Even though folks that might live in a mobile home park or a manufactured home community own their homes, they're still renting the space underneath that home. And so they might have a house, but they're paying rent. And so this gives them the ability, depending on their income and qualifications, to get $150 credited to the park for that rental space. We also do a weatherization assistance program, and basically this allows us to go in, work with some subcontractors, and develop energy efficiencies, hopefully reducing the energy burden for low-income and moderate-income individuals. This is our, where's Betsy? There you go, Betsy. You guys have probably seen this before. This ties in with sort of our database, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But effectively what this is, mvhousingsearch.org, is our affordable housing directory. So if you have folks that are coming to you looking for where can I potentially move, what's available throughout the state, you go to the mvhousingsearch.org website. It's free for landlords to list. It's free for folks to use. They have an incredible accessibility program. So even if you don't have a computer, there's an 800 number. They'll talk you through it. We require all of our recipients of tax credits to list their properties on this. So this is a really good source for finding out what's available for individuals looking for affordable rental housing. And now we want to kind of go back to the 80th legislative session and talk about things that were accomplished earlier this year. And I'm going to take it actually back. Let's go back to the 79th legislative session. Effectively, the Housing Division was involved in one bill, which was the merger of the Manufactured Housing Division with the Housing Division. And that was our kind of one bill. But there was another really important piece of legislation that came out of that bill, and that was the creation of the Interim Committee to Study Affordable Housing. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But that was created in the 79th session, so go back to 2017. In 2019, 2017 we had one bill, 2019 we had about a dozen that affected housing. So you can see, it has the legislature's attention. And so I'm going to start with the bills that were created without the interim committee, and then I'll focus on the 5 bills a little deeper that had to do with the interim committee. So the first one I'll mention is AB 174, and that created the Nevada Interagency Council on Homelessness. And we've had a Nevada Interagency Council on Homelessness. That was created by executive order through Governor Sandoval. With the change of administration, this was codified into statute. So by doing that, it enables the state to receive funding for homeless activities. So that's sort of one of the requirements to get those things. So you have a state-level Nevada Council on Homelessness. Actually, Homelessness to Housing is actually its title. We have AB 364. This was another bill that we were involved in, revising provisions governing titles and transfer of manufactured homes. In many, many cases, manufactured homes get transferred. Somebody gives somebody a few $100, and somebody lives in a home, and there's no paper transfer of titles. So this gives us an avenue to create sort of those missing blocks to get the home titled properly in someone's name. AB 476 creates the Housing Advisory Committee and the Private Activity Bond Council. These are actually this thing did this particular bill did 3 things. It created the Housing Advisory Committee. It created the Private Activity Bond Committee. So these are advisory groups that basically will be working with in developing policy and procedures and trying to advance the ball forward with both housing and then the Private Activity Bond Council, because those Private Activity Bond Council or bonds trip that 4% mechanism in the tax credits. The other thing that it did was it gave the Housing Advisory Committee a bill draft request, which means that they get to put a housing bill forward specifically from that committee. So as you all talk about advocacy and moving forward, we'll be listening with that particular committee and trying to assist you in advancing at least one housing bill.
Right, that's exciting.
We have SB 151, which made changes to summary evictions. That's not my wheelhouse. Fortunately, if you have questions about that, we have somebody who can answer those questions. Effectively, what it does, and I'm probably going to parse it down to what I view it as, two things. Number one, it changed the process where evictions now basically can't happen within a working week period. It goes 7 days or 5 business days. So people can react to that a little bit. And then it also caps late fees. And I'm sure it does more than that, but those are the two main components that I see. SB 367 had to do with pet-friendly housing. And that means that if you received affordable housing trust funds, you must have a mechanism for allowing pets. SB 371 related to the repair of manufactured homes, allowing, hopefully what it'll do is allow for an easier, low-cost mechanism to get repairs of manufactured homes in manufactured home communities, and we'll see how that goes. So I want to talk now about what the interim committee to study affordable housing focused on. And the first one that I'll mention is SB 103. And I appreciate the coalition supported all 5 of these. And you may be familiar, but we'll see how these kind of move forward. SB 103 reduced subsidized impact fees imposed for the purpose which an enterprise fund was created. So that results in the governing body, so a local jurisdiction, may reduce or subsidize impact fees for the development of affordable housing. So far I haven't seen any jurisdictions approach this other than the city of Reno, which had it as a discussion point, but they tabled it at the last meeting that I saw. So they will be talking about SB 103 and how it will intersect with affordable development in the city of Reno. But they're the only jurisdiction that I've been witness to that's moving the ball forward on this particular one. So keep an eye on that. SB 104 was effectively a cleanup of our housing database, and I have our housing database expert here if you have questions in those regards. So it tied some things legislatively together that makes it a little bit easier to provide you the database, and I know Betsy came out with some new figures that she has. Are they in the back? They're in the back. If you want to pick some of those up, they are on our website. And we just redid our website, so if you're used to going there, there's a lot of changes, but the database is up and active on that website, and I'm getting a nodded yes. We have SB 425. And again, this is not something I'm an expert to talk about, but basically it requires the Director of Health and Human Services to amend the state plan for Medicaid to provide for some home services. So basically, and again, this is just, we have another expert, overarching, hopefully they can use their Medicaid dollars for housing effectively. And then we had SB 473, and there were some folks that were assisting on us creating what we call definitions of affordable housing. Because as you go through and you talk about affordability, it runs the gamut. Everybody has a different view and exactly what it is. So what we attempted to do was to modify some of those definitions and put them into 3 tiers. And the first tier, which is sort of where most of all those programs that I discussed operates, would be tier 1. And that's for folks who have 60% of area median income for the county in which the house, where they're located, and they can't spend more than 30% of their total monthly household income on housing. So, I don't think I said that very well, but anyway, there's that's the first, if you will, bucket of affordable housing. Tier 2 is 60 to 80. We have some programs that can work up into the 80% range. But this creates sort of another bucket where it's low to somewhat moderate income. And then we have tier 3 affordable housing, which has those same stipulations, 80 to 120%. And the thought process behind this, and there's no programs, no federal programs that will address tier 3 housing. What we're hoping to do with this is sort of create some bullseyes and some targets that if a local jurisdiction wanted to create funding or mechanisms in that sort of way, they can now have a place where they can identify it. And that 80 to 120%, that's often the missing middle that you hear about, where people need help and there's just nothing there. So that's effectively what the definitions bill did. And then we come to sort of our crowning glory, and that's SB 448. And SB 448 allows the Housing Division to issue transferable tax credits to projects. So it's effectively, we've talked about the federal tax credit program. We now have a state tax credit program. And this is $10 million a year for the next 4 years. It's a pilot program, and what we are doing is to try to allocate those funds for the production of housing and advancing this forward. So this is incredibly exciting. I'm kind of running out of breath here, but it's really the biggest thing in this whole package that I just discussed as far as advancing affordable housing. And so we actually just released our QAP, and that's our qualified allocation plan. And that's where we've created the threshold points for the allocation of these credits. And we will be having a meeting on November 15th. If you all haven't gotten that invitation, some of you have, some of you may not have received that, where we'll be discussing our revamped QAP and these affordable state housing tax credits. So that's what we've been up to. It's a lot. And I want to thank Senator Ratty for really advancing a number of the bills that you saw there, because, as I said, we don't do this without collaboration. And this now, people always talk about tools in the toolbox. We have much better, sharper tools. And so from a legislative standpoint, that has really assisted us in moving the ball forward. Brooke really touched on all this stuff with the federal legislation. I did want to mention one that I didn't hear you mention, and that's the, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Housing Credit Improvement Act because she already did that, but S 1956 and HR 3479, which is the Save Affordable Housing Act of 2019. When I talked about the federal programs, the 9% and the 4% program, those are federal programs administered by the IRS. The IRS has a process that, and when you sign up, you're signed up for affordability for 30 years. However, at 15 years, little post 15 years, there's a little escape valve for the investor, and that's called the qualified contract process. That process causes us some consternation. From a state level, we have put the kibosh on it. If you're going to receive tax credits from us, you are signed up for 30 years. However, that has only been in place for a few years, so we've got sort of this bleed off of potential properties that may leave the program. And they may leave the program because, as you've all experienced, Nevada rents have gone through the roof, and if you can take one of these projects and turn it into market rate from an investment standpoint, that's a pretty good deal. So this particular bill will eliminate the ability from a federal level to exit through that process. So I just wanted to bring that up. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Steve. So I hope I was right. I hope you all learned something that you didn't know when you came into the room today. I know I did. I appreciate these folks being here and sharing their time with us. We have some time set aside for questions. If you have some questions, let's see what our experts know. If you don't have any, I have some. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question on the demographics. I was wondering what demographics were included in the information that you have on your website. And I noticed that it was a little bit limited in the federal demographics. What can we do to have more inclusive information in different groups? Like, for example, Native American groups were mentioned, but they weren't in the graphs, etc.
I think for us, the limitation is the data that, and I'm not on the research team, so I don't know what the limitations are, but I think it's something to do with the data that they use. There's not a complete data set for all of the demographics, other than those three main ones that we used, for every state and metropolitan and county. So we do have that available in some places, but not every place, so to keep it consistent across the board, those are the ones that we pulled out. But that is a great question, and we do work on like tribal and native legislation. We have a policy person who focuses on that, so I'm sure she knows where we can find additional data that she uses. But for that specific report, that's why.
And I will tell you too that the state is just finishing up its process on its 5-year plan for federal funding. And it just went through some hearings on that. There's a tremendous amount of data available through that process, and I believe she'd get that in the from GOED. Would that be?
Yeah, it would be in the state consolidated plan, which I'm not sure what the deadline is for releasing that, but that does come out of the Governor's Office of Economic Development.
Because I'm finding the same thing with education data. Now, housing data, there is not information for certain populations. So just thinking, what can we do? I would like to encourage whatever steps need to be taken to make that information available so we can have a complete picture.
And that is really a great resource. That they put together a ton of data for that. And we can hook you up with the right person to call after the meeting.
Yeah, and you can reach out to me and I can see what else we can find, just that specific report. That's what we had. So I'm sure we have additional data available.
Great question.
I was curious, Brooke, with your data that you showed, a lot of R's next to the bills, and a lot of D's, not R's. And I heard a report that said that we have a record low mobility rate across the United States for employees able to move from state to state. I think that's impacted by affordable housing. So I'm wondering whether that's a discussion item, and whether it's state or local legislative sessions about, this is not only a place for people to live, this is actually impacting businesses and their profitability and their ability to have employees at their businesses.
Yeah, definitely. I think our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, which is our multi-sector, touches on economic growth and jobs. And I'm not sure if they get to the mobility piece, but I think you could easily tie that into the data that they have on their fact sheets of why this is important for states to pay attention to. Yeah, that's a great point.
And of course, that's a huge factor in Nevada. We've had so much economic growth in the recent history. We're having a hard time finding places for all those folks to live. That's put a lot of pressure on our housing market and forced a lot of people at the lower end of the income spectrum out of housing to accommodate those folks who are coming in. So it's been a big challenge for us here, for sure. Any other questions? Eric?
Brooke, thanks for bringing up we cite the gap report in quite often, just that statistic that I think there's 19 units below 30% of AMI in Nevada for every 100 households below 30% of AMI, which is the lowest in the whole country. I think the average for the country is like 32 units or something like that. So it's an extraordinary figure, and we cite that quite often. Do you know where we are with the 2020 budget? I mean, I saw that the Senate committee has come up with their allocation for HUD, where the House is and what the next steps are with that and so on.
Yeah, so the House had passed their funding package prior to the actual budget deal that was made. So it was kind of the cart before the horse of they didn't actually know what numbers were going to be available before they determine their allocations. So and we pushed the Senate to do the same because we just wanted to encourage higher numbers overall for the budget. But then that means that now that the budget is lower than the House numbers had anticipated, they're going to have to bring their spending levels down. So the Senate was lower for housing and community development programs than the House side. So they're going to have to come together in a conference and figure out where to meet in the middle.
Is
so that's
there
where they're
assumption, so the last 2 years have been the best years for housing in many, many years, and since before the financial crisis. Is there a sense that we're going to get one more year before, I mean, there's a cliff that's coming.
Yeah, so the Senate side was lower than what we saw in the House, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't still an increase in some programs. A lot of it was kind of level spending or a slight increase. So we're really encouraging them to just work together to at the very least maintain those numbers. So we're not really sure what's going to happen because the whole border wall conversation is coming into play again this year, which is what caused the government shutdown last year. So that's why I really emphasize the point of just having, try to keep these numbers as high as you can, but also work with your colleagues because the shutdown is going to hurt low-income people and housing providers. So we have a fact sheet on our website about how government shutdowns hurt people and housing programs, if you're interested in checking that out. But yeah, we're really kind of just waiting to see because the current continuing resolution ends November 21st. So we'll see how everything's behind closed doors right now. Yeah.
I will add that a government shutdown from the perspective of the housing authority is a bad thing. So we don't want to see that again. Any other questions? Brooke, there's a lot of legislation that you mentioned. We know a lot of legislation is introduced that never really sees the light of day. How much of this do you think really has a good shot of getting passed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act is probably one of the greatest chances we have at passing some legislation, and that's just really because of how many bipartisan co-sponsors are on it. And I think with it being a tax-related bill, any other tax legislation, and there's conversations of some tax reform happening yet this year, that could serve as a vehicle to move that through. So I think that's the greatest chance of the near future of what we see passing. But I think the others with, as it is the case any year, but especially this year with the House being Democratic and the Senate being Republican, anything that is bipartisan is going to have a greater chance at passing. So we're really pushing for that, but also keeping the conversation going with these other bold proposals and seeing that the conversation is shifting to create, those bold proposals are making those bold numbers more of a norm than just this crazy dream number, if that makes sense.
You bet. And that's great to see, too, that housing is really becoming part of the conversation. A number of the presidential candidates now have housing as part of their platform. So it's exciting just to have the conversation happen. Bruce?
This question's for Steve. The 4% tax credit program has been responsible in the last several years for quite a few units of affordable housing in Nevada. But because the state only gets a certain amount of federally allocated volume cap which can do these bonds, and the biofuels project used about 300 million of that, and now we have a bullet train from California to Nevada, which would be 100 million a year volume cap. The money is not flowing to the housing division as it typically would at the end of the year, now that we have all these economic development projects. How is that going to impact your 4% program moving forward?
So it's a high concern of ours. Effectively, the private activity bonds are, as I mentioned, the greatest production of housing in the state. I know the governor's office is looking at the impact that the train will have. We're working with them to make sure it doesn't impact dramatically the affordable housing. We want to still work with that component. But to your point, there have been other asks of it. One of the things that we've done sort of proactively, in order, and this kind of gets into the weeds, but in order for those tax credits to hit, 50% of the bonds have to be done in private activity. This is an IRS requirement. But you can still do 50% taxable bonds. Well, those rates are about right on top of each other, so when we go to the developers, and the safe harbor is really 55%, so we're asking for each project that used to take 100% of the bond capacity for a project, if there's a $40 million private activity bond ask, we would allocate 40 million through private activity bonds. Now we're doing 55% of that through private activity bonds, 45 through taxable bonds, and that's getting us to extend that a little bit. So.
I want to give you a hug for that question, Bruce. That was really good. Thank you.
I knew it was coming.
Impacts a lot of programs that you guys do.
Yep. Yeah.
For sure.
No, we and to I think maybe sort of look at that. I think in the past that sort of has been bond cap, and we allocate, and now I think we have to get a little bit more surgical about it. I think that's probably the best answer to the question, is we have to make sure what we're using it for, the right projects, and because it is going to be a $100 million ask for the train. 2 out of at least the next 3 years is sort of where I see it.
And that's something the coalition will certainly have as a conversation for the next year or so. We're very interested in how that's going to work out.
Yeah,
sure.
And to go back, and just one last thing, you go back to the Housing Advisory Committee and the Private Activity Bond Council, and there will be some input in regards to priorities.
Which is great. That was a great part of the legislation that happened last year too. While you're talking about private activity bonds, can you tell us real quickly what's under development or under lease here in the area that's
sure.
being constructed, new stuff?
We've got a lot in that particular field, and there's a number of projects that have just come on. I mentioned Vintage at the Crossings, 200 plus senior complex that opened earlier this year. Down off of South Meadows by the Walmart, actually won a national award for their design and their services. So Jim, congratulations. Jim Zaccheo is the developer there. We just had the grand opening for Sanctuary by Vintage. Again, another Jim project. Steamboat, I'm sorry. Thank you. 360 full affordable units down at the southeast corner of Geiger Grade and the old 395. and that's a beautiful project. We have up in the northwest where the old Super K was, if you all know where that was, and they had a huge parking lot. It's now going to be, and I apologize, I don't remember the size of it. Jim could tell me if necessary. 288, thank you. Full affordable complex. Those are all under construction. We just got approval for Sanctuary, which will be a senior affordable project at Yorie and Gentry, very much modeled after the vintage at the Crossings. I think that's all the 4% stuff that we have under construction. I do want to recognize that we use that same program for preservation. And if you think of affordable housing in a big barrel, we want to keep adding to that barrel, but we need to also plug the hole and make sure that nothing's draining out. That goes back to that qualified contract process. And so there are 740 units that have been previously approved for preservation. And then we have 2 coming up, hopefully at the next Board of Finance, to preserve another roughly 400 units here in Reno.
Fantastic.
So
Fantastic.
it's busy. It's been a busy year.
Yeah, no kidding.
And to that point, and I wanted to mention this, and I neglected to when Bruce asked. He mentioned that we get bond cap, and both the 9% credits we get and the bond cap allocations that we get are based on population. And if you haven't heard it, please, whatever you can do, again, an advocacy group, make sure people get out and do the census. That's hugely important, because every dollar or every person that we don't count are dollars that we're not going to get for these particular programs. So anyway, just needed to throw that out there.
No, thank you. That's fantastic.
Bill, I just want to, so while there's a lot of new production, I just want to point out that the Crossings project was the very first bond deal in 15 years in Northern Nevada. And so the gap funding program that the state came up with, combined with a new way that HUD decides on what they call difficult development areas, those 2 things allowed these projects to go forward for them to be financially feasible for the first time in 15 years. And so there's just been a small window that the bond program used to produce 55–60% of our affordable housing in the state, and that it just stopped in the mid-2000s. And so it's been very exciting to see new production happening for the first time in many years. And we are concerned about volume cap because volume cap was easily, I mean, we had lots for many years. It wasn't something to worry about. Nevada has a very unique system for allocating volume cap, but in particular, affordable housing is not a priority in the state allocation system. It's actually below economic development and other priorities. It's the way it's allocated right now, the housing division doesn't actually get $1 of volume cap every year for bond projects. And so they have to go jurisdiction by jurisdiction asking for it. It's, and I don't know that it's I mean, if we continue to have this one project sweeping all of our bonding authority for a year without any real public dialogue, that's not a viable system in the future. And it was upsetting to see the allocation of 200, basically 2/3 of our volume cap for a year going to the train project from Las Vegas to Vacaville without any public dialogue. And I think that's something that the housing division, the housing coalition could be working on in the future.
I'll temper that. That hasn't happened yet. So, but I know it's in discussion.
Just that it would be a shame that the new tax credit, the new state credit that should boost production, would be a shame if that ends up just going to replace the bond cap and the 4% credits would increase.
Yeah, we don't anticipate that. That's again part of the discussions. I will tell you from my chair, the most important thing that I can do is for the next 4 years, in particular the next 2 years, is to get that out, get it to the projects that are being developed, and create and produce the housing that we need. Because, as I mentioned, that's a pilot program. We need it to be a permanent program.
Yes.
And so that is number one priority from my view.
And I think it'll go out. I just wonder if it'll go out, and if there's less bond cap, now those credits are gonna fill that gap.
That's part of, again, back to that surgical procedure. We want to make sure that that absolutely is a success.
So,
And I was just wondering, you know, if there is going to be a hearing or something that we should go to have some public dialogue, as he was bringing out, about the funding for the train.
I can't speak to that. That's business and industry. But yeah, I'm sure they have to have public meetings in those regards.
there actually was a public meeting in Las Vegas 2 weeks ago, Eric.
There was a TEFRA hearing.
TEFRA hearing.
That was, the invitees were labor unions, financiers, and
Okay.
train
Yeah, there weren't any housing people in the room.
So that might be something maybe we could publish when the hearings are, so that we can be in attendance and speak up.
That meeting was noticed publicly. Unfortunately, again, it wasn't on the NHD's website or housing websites, and so none of the housing people knew about it. But it was publicly noticed. Any other questions?
I just comment, I mean, I think that's a great example of how it's really important that everybody support this very brand new housing coalition so that we can get the staff hired, so that we can have the people who are available to get the word out about those kinds of things that aren't going to maybe always be as obvious as they used to be, that are critically important to housing. So I'm just going to make a plug for the Housing Coalition to say, when I started trying to work on affordable housing as a state senator 2 years ago, there wasn't a group that I could go talk to say, okay, what are good ideas, what are policies? I had to go like create those relationships individually, one by one. And we really need, if we're going to continue to move the needle in the state of Nevada, we really need for the Housing Coalition to be successful. And so buy your memberships, figure out what corporations you know that can be sponsors, do whatever we can to make sure that this is a stable and ongoing effort, because the education is important, the information sharing is important, and the advocacy is important, because you have a citizen legislature that's, you know, we're doing the best we can, but we really need the subject matter experts to be there providing the ideas and the things that we can move forward.
Perfect plug for the coalition. Thank you so much. If you don't already belong to the coalition, please see this nice lady in the blue top back here. She'll take good care of you. And get signed up. We want you to be a part of the solution in Nevada. We want to work with you to help make housing happen. And it's through all of this effort that it does. Any other questions?
I just want to say one thing. I neglected to mention another project that's under development, which is the Summit Project, the mixed income at Geiger Gray.
Right next to the Summit.
Right next to the Summit Mall. So that'll have a component, 180 rough units of affordability in a mixed income project.
So a lot of exciting things happening.
There's a lot
right
going
now.
on.
Really good. If you haven't had a bagel or some breakfast, get one. If you had one, get another one. Don't forget the materials that we have for you out here in the hallway. Eileen?
Just a shameless announcement. So in addition to the Housing Coalition hiring, RCAC's hiring for housing technical assistance.
And RCAC is who?
Rural Community Assistance Corporation.
Which is a,
Nonprofit technical assistance provider around the western U.S.
so you guys are all over the place out here in the West and do some really good work here in Nevada as well. Thank you. Appreciate all of you coming. Please do some advocacy, as Brooke taught us about. Call your legislator. Those guys really do pay attention to the phone calls and the letters. They really do. So just a handful of those could really make a big difference. Thank you very much for coming this morning. We look forward to seeing you again.